Well, let's get started. Again, welcome everybody to Greensboro Bound Online. A little outline, well, I guess I'll introduce myself first. My name is Alexis Orgera, and I'm a friend of Greensboro Bound and Scuppernong Books, publisher and a writer, freelance editor. And tonight I will be speaking with Emily Nemens, who's going to read from her wonderful novel, Cactus League. Sorry.
It was me, sorry.
Okay, that's all right.
I'll work on that, keep going.
Okay, no problem. Emily Nemens is a writer, illustrator, and editor. Her debut novel released in February, and it's, as I said, the Cactus League, and it orbits the lives of a series of characters all linked by baseball, and in particular, a star outfielder named Jason Goodyear during spring training in Arizona. Emily's short stories have appeared in places like Blackbird, Esquire, Iowa Review, the Gettysburg Review, and she's published illustrations in the New Yorker. And I'm really excited to talk about your watercolor portraits of women of the Congress. We can talk about that later, which were featured all over the internet and on national TV. And last but not least, Emily has been the co-editor of Southern Review and is now the 7th editor of the Paris Review. So Emily, I will hand it over to you to read a few sections from the book, and then we'll have a talk.
That sounds great. Thank you, Alexis, for being in conversation, and thank you to Greensboro Bound and Jessica for hosting this and organizing it. I really wanted to make my way down to North Carolina this spring, but it's nice to spend Friday night with all of you. So my book, The Cactus League, is about spring training in Arizona, and I thought I'd read just a little bit from the very beginning to set the scene, and then I'll jump ahead. Welcome to Salt River Fields, the newest spring training facility in Scottsdale, Arizona. Turn east off of Pima, drive down the fresh boulevard Lyons Way. You're flanked by parking lots so new they still smell like tar. They're white hatching wet. Ample parking for the anticipated crowds already sold out for opening day. Note the median's plantings, environmentally sustainable xeriscape. Of course, this is 2011, and the club cares about our natural resources, is mindful of the perpetual drought in Phoenix Metro. A few Christmas cacti bloom, despite it being February. And here, at the terminus of the boulevard, the centerpiece of the multi-field complex, the 12,000-seat stadium that will be the new springtime home of your Los Angeles Lions. Take it all in, the crisp chalk diamond, the ruddy arc of infield, the bright checkerboard of the outfield. It's not easy to grow grass like that in the desert. I offer a hat tip to the grounds crew. And see out past the warning track and fence, there's the shot green tilt of a well-watered general admission lawn. Farther still, on the horizon, a ridge of mountains jutting into the blue like the teeth of some mile-high rusted saw. Take note of the architecture, the exposed steel beams and brick, a slate gray cantilevered canopy over a sunken seating bowl, the polished concrete rotunda and concourse. A classic-looking stadium. Timeless in design, some might say, even if it's anything but. Nothing is static, not the bluegrass-ryegrass blend growing out there, not the architecture, not the angle of the sun hitting the seats. And not a man's career, especially not a ball player the first weeks of spring. His batting average, his ambition, his hopes, all is in flux. I'm looking toward Lions left fielder Jason Goodyear as I write this, coming off a Gold Glove and a close second place in American League MVP voting, coming off a possible divorce and a lonely drive across the desert in his busted old Jeep. Doesn't Cadillac give you a car if you do that many ads? But that feeling of uncertainty isn't reserved for all-stars and the freshly dumped. It could apply to any player on the squad, any coach on the bench, any man in the executive suite, any fan in the stands. I'm looking at his entourage, his agent Herb Allison, his maybe wife Liana, his favorite minor league hitting coach, and the devotees who would give an eye tooth just to be near him. It's all up in the air. Here's the thing about baseball and all else. Everything changes. Whether it's the slow creep of glaciers dripping toward the sea, or the steady piling up of cut stones, rock upon rock, until the wall reaches chest high, nothing is still. Sometimes change comes as quick and catastrophic as a line drive. Hear the crack of wood displacing a sphere of leather, yarn, rubber, and cork. Watch how it pushes the ball flat and then just as quickly forward. The action springs the left fielder from his squat, and the man's metal spikes tear into the turf, kicking up tiny wedges of grass, sending them towards the sky. Sure, I followed I-10 across the desert to write the story of one remarkable man, but baseball's not that kind of game. It's too long and complicated to say, he did this, he said that, then this happened. That sufficed when I was first working the beat, so wet behind the ears and liable to get lost on my way to the press room. Back then, it was get the score, get the quote, add a little color, and file. I was such a kid, spooked by his own damn shadow, downright fearful of asking any kind of tough question, something that might be construed as disagreeable. No, I'm no muckraker, and not setting out to take down a great man, but in this life things are complex, some questions are hard, and that's why I drove to Arizona in the first place. So that is our narrator. He's an out-of-work sports writer, and without being too didactic, I like reading that because it sort of sets the tone for the book. That entourage that we're talking, that he mentions, his agent, his maybe wife, his minor league batting coach. The book moves from, through different perspectives, different focuses around the stadium, and a chapter lands with each of those people, all while sort of advancing the story of Jason Goodyear. And that sports writer shows up between every chapter, sort of to lay it out, what's going on and what might happen next. Because this is kind of a baseball book, there's a lot of things happening off the field, but there is some baseball being played, and there is no baseball being played out in the world until I think what they announced it will be July 23 or 24 that the season starts. I wanted to stop right in the middle of the book and read a few pages that do take place on the field. Like I said, there's different chapters, and some of them are about Jason, some of them are about front office and bench guys, and there are other players, of course, that Jason interacts with. So this chapter starts, it's called Cut Meeting, and I'll just read the first 2 pages. A bright afternoon, blue sky, a sharp diamond of sun. Greg Carver is standing on the rubber, and a man, the catcher, is jogging out to the mound. He knows this guy, the spire plug of a ball player with the long scar on his cheek, the flat nose of a boxer, a nickel gap between his front teeth. He knows him, and his name is, the pitcher tries A's, then B's, running down the alphabet, Casey, Dave, Elliott, as the man approaches, lumbering under his gear. J, Jimmy. Jimmy's wearing a Lions uniform, as is Greg, white with black pinstripes, gold Los Angeles across the chest. This is surprising. The last time they played together, they were both stallions, black and gold too, but a different creature with hooves, a different place, Salt Lake, no red mountains rimming the horizon. I should say I made up a baseball team, the Los Angeles Lions, and the Salt Lake Stallions are their AAA affiliate. What's up, Jimmy? Greg glances over his shoulder to the left field scoreboard. It says that the Lions are winning over the Padres 5-2. It says it's the 6th that they have one out. He sees a runner on second, the man's hands on his hips. Greg turns back to Jimmy, who's staring at him. You okay, Carv? Jimmy asks. His gold catcher's mask is pushed high on his forehead, a halo. Why wouldn't I be okay? Greg rubs the ball hard with his thumb, trying to ignore the sensation in his elbow. It's coming back quickly, the pain a drumbeat that keeps hurrying up. You seem a little spacey. I'm fine. What did Coach Stu say? Greg has no recollection of a visit from Coach Stu. No idea who that is or what he said. Nothing much. The wing? Jimmy glances at the cut, the pale skin and red seam, the scarred over eyelets of the stitches. 26. One for every year, the doctor had said, like it was a good thing to be reminded of his station, that he'd be 27 before he threw again. All winter, Greg had worn his sleeve long to keep from seeing it, but this afternoon is too hot for anything more than the jersey. It's fine. He flaps his elbow to indicate as much. The pane had been small, rounded and soft and smushed to fit into the palm of his hand, but that up and down sends it spinning into a larger shape, all sharp angles. The catcher's eye jumped to the arm and back. In Greg's mind, the scar is glowing. The scar is leering. The scar is 6'2", brown-haired and blue-eyed, a minor league pitcher trying to make the team. Think you can finish out the inning? I'm getting it over the plate, aren't I? The scar talks. The scar listens. The scar answers to the name of Greg. The catcher studies the pitcher's face. What did he see from behind the plate? What does he see from a foot away? The sweat dripping down Greg's face? He wipes at it with his shoulder. Mostly, yeah. It's been 6 innings? Well, 5 1/3, but yeah. So, Jimmy's face bursts into a wide, crooked smile. That gap again. You got this. He smacks Greg on the butt, trots a few paces, and turns back. Oh, he says, pulling the web of his glove over his mouth. This guy hit 30 homers last year, so keep it in. As Jimmy returns to the plate, Greg Carver looks around. The sunny afternoon, the impressive, unfamiliar stadium. The seats of the lower deck are mostly filled with gold-shirted fans. The red mountains he recognizes from Arizona springs past. This is Lions spring training. He's pitching. Jimmy squats, flashes a signal between his legs. Greg nods, not that he remembers what that signal means, but because he knows to nod back. Jimmy spreads his feet, settling into his ankles to receive the impact of the pitch. That he recognizes, his best friend's posture when he's expecting a breaking curve. Greg looks at the ball in his hands, adjusts his fingers. He takes a deep breath and readies himself for a rocket of pain. And with it, the ball goes flying.
I love that section. I'm glad that you read it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah, please.
So you're obviously a fan of the game of baseball. I'm wondering if you can outline for us kind of your experience as a fan and then how that informed the writing of this book.
Sure. I grew up in Seattle, and my dad grew up in New York. So he moved to the Northwest in the late 70s, right when the franchise was starting. And I'm the younger of 2 daughters, and my older sister had no interest in nothing to do with baseball. And so, I was sort of dragged to the stadium at the beginning, but, the late 80s was a really cool time to be a Mariners fan. It was Ken Griffey Jr.'s rookie year, Edgar Martinez, who is arguably the best designated hitter in the history of the game, Randy Johnson, all 6'10" of him, throwing, 100-mile-per-hour pitches. It was really exciting, and it was a thing I did with my dad. And I got to baseball early and fell in love. And that being said, Seattle, in the 80s and 90s, they played baseball in the Kingdome, which was astroturfed. It was one of those big donut stadiums. Was kind of, a sterile and not great place to watch baseball. And so when I was, probably 11 or 12, my dad and I decided to go down to Arizona for spring training and just do a quick weekend trip. If you time your flights right, you get there, Friday morning and leave Sunday night, you can see 3 games in 3 days. And it was literally a breath of fresh air to see baseball outdoors, but you're in these tiny stadiums where it's all so intimate, and, the players, there's so many of them around, like you're likely to run into one, and it's more casual, more relaxed because the games don't count. And, it was just, as a fan, and a fan used to, watching baseball on AstroTurf, watching it in this bright desert sun was so intoxicating. And we didn't go every year, but we went every so often, and I kept that tradition up with him. When I went east for college, and I lived on the East Coast for 10 years before going down to Louisiana for graduate school. And so Phoenix was still sort of in the middle between New York and Seattle. So as a fan, I really loved Arizona. I loved spring training. I really liked watching, well, not liked, but I was fascinated to see how Phoenix changed so much. You know, it was that timeline of the mid 90s to the book is set in 2011 also coincides with this very huge boom in the city and the infrastructure of the place, and of course the bust of the recession. So, you know, not necessarily in the sections I just read, but the idea of home and the housing crisis and building a home and preserving a home, and the home of this new stadium sort of rising from the ashes of the Great Recession are definitely a part of it as well. So, you know, I didn't think when I was 12, like I'm doing research for my first book, but, you know, going to a place and revisiting it and trying new things every time you're there and noticing how it evolves, that really got, you know, in my head and under my skin. And so when I started, of course, there was a ton of research, but I also sort of understood this place over the passage of really almost 20 years, right?
Yeah, and the landscape really does become a character, I think, in the novel, especially in those chapters where the sports writer, the out-of-work sports writer is talking, and he's, you know, bumping up geological time up against baseball. You know, that landscape becomes really important.
Yeah.
I wonder, did the themes of how we're all sort of small in the face of all of this, and I think you read in the first chapter about uncertainty and how everything changes. Were these kind of themes that grew up as you were writing, or was it something you'd been thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think growing up in the West, and, you know, it's not dissimilar where you are, the landscape is really important, you know, and landscape writing and thinking about nature and thinking about preservation, that's just, you know, baked into me as a person. I care about the natural environment. And as someone who lived in New York, lives here again, my dad is not only a baseball fan, but also a city planner. And my last job before I went to Louisiana was working at the American Institute of Architects, like just really thinking about, you know, and that was when they were rebuilding downtown and thinking about, you know, rezoning the whole city, or like 20% of the city was rezoned and rebuilt during that period. So thinking about the built environment and caring about the natural environment, and, you know, the part of Phoenix Metro where the book takes place is that liminal space. It's the farthest suburb before you hit a mountain range and in a reservation. So like the building literally can't go any farther because there's, you know, the terrain, you know, unless you blow up the side of the mountain, you can't go farther. And so that border, that barrier was really interesting to me. And yeah, so, you know, I think particularly working with architects for several years in my 20s and just being interested and impressed by, you know, monumental architecture, I wanted to sort of put even that in its place. Like, you know, yes, a 12,000 seat stadium is an innovative and big deal, but as compared to mountain range, it's still sort of a gut check that it makes every sort of human story a bit smaller or more approachable, or it puts everything maybe not in its place, but in perspective.
Right. Quick reminder that if anyone here wants to ask questions, the chat feature is open. I don't know if you saw that note from Jessica. So anyone who wants to ask questions, I would be happy to relay them to Emily. Did you ever want to be a sports writer?
I did. I thought about it. Actually, when I, you know, moved to Louisiana, it was for both a job at the Southern Review and for my graduate program. I picked that graduate program because it came with a fellowship at the Southern Review. But, you know, when I thought I want to write about sports, I think I'm going to write, you know, a very early version of this book was my graduate thesis. And, you know, when I said, okay, I'm going to write a book about baseball, I just sort of went all into, you know, just read sports literature, novels, but also long form journalism. And I talked my way into LSU's football's press corps for a season, and I was writing for the like alt weekly in Baton Rouge about sort of, I was never super excited or felt particularly equipped to do like the quick file, game recap kind of writing, but thinking about the characters playing the games, thinking about the structures that supported them and that were built out of them was really interesting. So it was the 2012 season, and there was like, we would go to the games, and there was like 2 retired writers and another guy working on a book and a guy who had a weekly TV show, and we just stayed in the corner, like stayed out of the way, because we weren't trying to live tweet or we weren't on deadline the same way. And that was, it was a lot of fun. I'm proud of, I didn't write that much that year, but I was happy with the stuff I wrote. And, it was many years until I realized the sports writer would be the narrator of this book. But I think sort of the culture of the press corps and the sort of the crisis that a lot of local newspapers were in then, and which has continued, but, the sort of the shedding of senior talent that was happening in the early 2000s, that began in the early 2000s. I saw that as well.
Yeah, I had a little stint writing for the Bleacher Report when it first started. So I feel that sort of pull.
What was your sport?
Basketball. Yeah. We have a question that has popped up. Let's look at a question from Rachel. Can you speak to what you envision happening for Goodyear at the end of the story? Is this a story of redemption?
Yes, it is. So folks who haven't maybe not read the book, just, it's tracking, Goodyear is, a generational player. He, he's got a 9-figure contract with the Lions. They've really built their entire team around him, and he's having a really bad spring. And, the ways in which he's gone wrong are sort of meted out and revealed across the book. I'm an optimistic person, and I didn't want everything to be resolved in a pat way, but I did want to leave the door open for the possibility of redemption or reorientation. I've been given, I was really interested in this idea that spring is, Doris Kearns Goodwin and the wait until next year notion, like there's always this hope, spring's eternal in spring. Phoenix is of course rising from the ashes, like all signs point to this will be better this year. But for all these characters, better this year isn't quite cutting it. It's still really hard and things are not going well. And how do we as individuals and we as a community cope with the idea that, even with a fresh start or a restart, things won't go well, was sort of something that I wanted not to be redundant, but to be a refrain of the book. But I hope he's okay.
I won't give it away for those of you who haven't read it, but the very final paragraph of the book for me is like the thesis of the book, and doesn't tie it in a nice neat bow, thankfully, but it is a beautiful kind of ending, I think, to the story. Sure. I wanted to ask a little bit about this theme of displacement too, and I think there's characters who are not where they want to be and not who they want to be and not who they want to be with, really. And this also speaks to the houses, the empty houses, and people going into empty houses and finding out that people have been squatting in their houses. There's a lot of displacement going on, and I think that speaks to where we are culturally a little bit right now too.
Right. I mean, the book is set in 2011, and as I started it in 2011, and as I was going, I kept trying to move it up. Like, can I make this contemporary? And then, sometime maybe around 2015 or so, I was like, no, absolutely not. I'm going to keep it in 2011 and just, you know, embrace the fact that I have like a recently historical novel. And 2011 I picked because that is when Salt River Fields, that the stadium, the team is fake, but the stadium is real, opened. So it just feels uncanny that, you know, a lot of the concerns about displacement and the recession felt like a historical novel in February and now feel very contemporary, you know, even just like talking about the shutdown of sports and the impact on the whole ecosystem of these stadiums, you know, was something that people started talking about really early in the pandemic in a way that, you know, I deal with pretty directly in the book, is thinking about not just the $200 million left fielder, but, you know, the woman selling popcorn and the concession workers that are also relying on this spring season to make, you know, a bulk of their income for the year. Their income being, you know, I'm so bad at math, but like 1/1000th of this other guy, right? But in terms of displacement, that's such a good question. You know, at the core of spring training, like their practice games, they don't count, but it's like the most stressful game of musical chairs out there, right? They invite 80 people to, now there's 26 guys on the roster, but you know, at the time, 25 guys are going to be Major League Baseball players at the end of it. So there's displacement just inherently in what happens across spring training. You know, there's I think they're usually on Thursdays. They're on Thursdays in my book, but there's a cut day where, you know, a certain number of guys get sent off to, you know, the minor league camp or just sent home entirely. So, so that's one kind of displacement. Of course, I think we think, you know, particularly with Instagram and sort of celebrity culture of not right now, but, you know, in recent years, the way people present sort of the lush life of professional athletes, that it's really glamorous, but, you know, the displacement of professional athletes is not comfortable. Like if you're from one place, you get signed with a team somewhere else, and then you have to spend 2 months in Arizona, you know, the nice way of saying that is you have 3 homes. The uncomfortable thing about that is that you're on the road all the time, and where is your family? If you have kids, where are they? So that was another sort of idea of displacement. And then to your point, what's happening in that community felt like a parallel thing of people trying to make homes and establish themselves. It was this very, you know, liquid and traumatic time for the housing stock in many cities, but, you know, Phoenix being a good example of that, of, you know, some communities being built in this really rapid way, and, you know, great accumulations of wealth and beautiful homes that sit empty for most of the year, where other people have lost their homes in the housing crisis, and just the churn of that, thinking about people, you know, who have too many homes and people that don't have home enough, and what happens when those people come together literally around the stadium, but are facing those same challenges. You know, of course they're going to come into conflict or into contact. And, you know, it didn't feel like a stretch to imagine, you know, one person squatting in another person's house. There's another chapter where we talk about, you know, a woman whose boyfriend, on again, off again boyfriend, is a developer who's, you know, lost his shirt. He's a local. He built 200 houses and they're all sitting empty because he doesn't have money to finish them. But she's in the test home because, you know, they kitted out the kitchen in that one, hoping that more people would buy more things. And, you know, as cheesy as it sounds, like this idea of home, there's also a new home stadium, right? And so what is that sense of, you know, the home field of Salt River Fields? I really like sort of the echo and the resonance and the way those dynamics spoke to one another.
Cool. We have another question popping up. There are a bunch of great baseball novels. Do you have a favorite or a most influential to your work? Also, Edgar is undoubtedly the best DH ever.
Yeah, thank you. When I was on, I had, like a mini book tour before everything shut down. And my last live event was in Seattle, my hometown. And I was in conversation with a woman who, a professor and teacher who helped me work on this at the Sewanee Writers Conference years and years ago. But like in 2014, we worked on chapter 7 together. And she came up to me beforehand and gave me Edgar Martinez's rookie card. She just said, I've had this since my boys were boys, and I think you need it. So I now possess Edgar Martinez's rookie card, which is very exciting. Favorite books, I started writing this right after encountering The Art of Fielding. I think I was excited and inquisitive and a little bit maybe arrogant, but just ambitious about writing back to or responding to that book when it arrived. Everyone's like, the literary baseball novel is back, and I admired that book, but it's not without flaws. And I just wanted to think about continuing that tradition, trying to do something different than what Chad did, and responding to that. So that book was really helpful to me. There's an anthology of New Yorker. I'm looking over, I have a whole bookshelf over here of just sports literature. A New Yorker anthology, long form sports writing from the magazine going back, to the early 20th century. And that was really helpful to me, not only because our narrator is a sports writer, but I thought, the kind of realism I was trying to achieve is not unlike John McPhee. Like, he was really, or Roger Angel, that kind of language and storytelling, the character portraits that are often central to those long form pieces, were inspiring. And I read a whole lot of long form nonfiction, and then tried to sort of write back into fiction, knowing the tricks not that I know the tricks of Roger Angel, but admiring that work and trying to respond to it.
That, by the way, that question was from Brian of Scuppernong Books and Greensboro Bound. So
great.
Sweet. I wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that you talked about this a bit, but that you studied art history and visual art in college and then worked for some architects. I'm wondering how that visual art background informed the writing, if it did or didn't.
Right. My art, I took all manner of art history classes, but my favorite was with this sort of very rigorous, classically trained art historian that was, very, very much, he studied French Impressionism and was very much a formalist, where, describing, every detail of a landscape and being able to articulate why all of these components are coming together in a composition, extrapolating maybe more than the painter intended, but also being that eye for detail. And I love that, I loved more contemporary art and more conceptual projects as well, but that sort of being able to describe a landscape was just catnip and really exciting to me. And so I think I very early just loved writing about place and describing scenes, working with the architects. If there are any architects on the call, I apologize, but they're generally inscrutable in terms of, brilliant ideas, but communication is not communication with language rather than, graphically, is more of a challenge. And, what I was trying to do with the AIA specifically was, convey the importance of design to New Yorkers, to general public people who appreciate architecture but might not know how to talk about it. You have architects who know how to talk about it but might not be able to convey why you should appreciate it. And the writing challenge of bridging that, gave me this whole vocabulary to talk about space. So I have an eye for detail from the art history and this vocabulary to talk about space and the way people move through it from the architects. And, I feel like in writing programs, and generally you hear about plot, you hear about character, and these were these two other things that, you know, I care about plot and character, of course I do, but I was just so excited about these other things as well, that really came into the story. And a lot of my writing early, and it has been sort of a resounding theme. That being said, I wrote too much description. This book, when I turned it in, was 25,000 words longer than it is now.
Wow.
And my editor said, you know, you got a lot of description, you kind of go on. And part of that was, you know, because there's so many overlapping narratives, there was a little bit, you know, some overlapping and redundant, you know, plot points and descriptions. But yeah, I cut 25,000 words of that beautiful description of the Arizona landscape. Not just the landscape in the stadium, but that sort of descriptive impulse. I loved it. I wrote it through, and then I cut a whole lot of it back, like line by line. I think I cut, you know, a few paragraphs occasionally. That chapter I read from with the Tommy John surgery, there was a whole subplot that I cut out of that one, so I lost like 2 pages at a time. But otherwise, it was just a much more, yeah, it was a slog.
I really, I like looking at this. I'm not a fiction writer, so I don't think about, you know, kind of the way one writes description to fit inside the narrative, really. But if you look at it from the kind of visual culture perspective and writing the landscape and extrapolating things from what you see in the landscape, it's like, you know, it's what I do with comp students when we do our visual culture unit, you know, here's a piece of visual art. Now we need to find the clues and then extrapolate.
Right. Well, and yeah, that's a great comparison. And I think the other thing I got from art history is, you know, you're identifying details and describing them, but, you know, on a certain level, one mode of inquiry is, you know, why does this painting matter? Why was it canonized? Why was it celebrated? Why was it put in the museum? Why is this the most important painter of that decade? And I think those questions say as much about what's going on in the rest of society and the rest of culture at that moment as it is about the artist. And you could say that same sentence and just, instead of saying artist, plug in, you know, celebrity, plug in baseball player. You know, like, of course there is a certain amount of performance and raw skill in terms of who's celebrated, but, you know, in terms of why, you know, 2 equivalent players are, or 2 teams who are both great, one is, you know, America's team and the other one isn't, that says something more about American culture at that moment than it does about the teams.
Yeah, interesting. About those 25,000 words that you cut, Stephen, I'm not sure which Stephen this is, so I'm not going to venture to guess, but will those 25,000 words find a home somewhere else?
Probably not. I mean, you know, I was asked, there's this new outlet called the Chronicles of Now, where it's short fiction in response to the news. And I like really don't believe in writing stories on spec personally. Other people can do it great, but I don't feel like, you know, the muse comes to me that way, nor do I really process. I mean, this book took me, you know, 8 or 9 years to write. I didn't think I could come to it that quickly, but someone asked me about, you know, the Arizona plan back in March when they were saying that all of Major League Baseball would go quarantine itself in Phoenix. And I just knew these players so well and this community so well. I popped out a story in a weekend about like, what if, you know, most of the players are still gone, but Jimmy was still catching because he was only 27 in 2011. So he would be what, you know, 35, like his knees are shot, but they keep him around. And Dorsey, the manager, was still, you know, even crotchetier than ever. So I do, you know, I had to stop, and I had to you know, I felt like the reading experience of this book, I wanted it to be a discreet and enjoyable thing in terms of pacing. But a lot of, you know, nuance and funny bits and charming characters and backstory and potential for a lot of these athletes was left on the floor. I think in terms of my next book, I want to do something different, but I still think about these guys every day.
Wow. I can imagine. Those characters live with you for a decade or more, you know, yeah. Right? Can we maybe, did you have any more sections you wanted to read?
No.
Okay.
I can read all night, but no, we don't need to.
Well, in book club, one of our participants really wanted to know what a typical kind of writing ritual looks like for you, or a typical day juggling writing and being the editor of the Paris Review. Yeah. And also how that informs your writing in general. Like, you're doing a lot of cutting and maneuvering things every day as an editor.
Right. To be perfectly honest, I don't have a great writing ritual. I really admire the folks who get in the hours every day. And just the nature of my job is one that I haven't figured out how to do that. So I'm a bit more of a snake where, I'll have a big meal and digest it for like a week or two and then come back. And it's been that way, in Louisiana, where my schedule was a little bit more manageable. I had a 4-10, so I would work at the magazine for 4 days, write for 2 days, and take a day off. And it's been a little bit more catch as catch can since I came back to New York. Obviously, when I was on deadline, I was writing all the time, and when I'm on deadline for the magazine, I'm editing all the time. I think that because so much of my work is, identifying strong writing, but then making it stronger, finding authors I admire and like picking apart that writing until I find holes or flaws or things that could be improved. I developed this sort of objectivity about it, and flexibility, because, I have very wide-ranging tastes, and so I'm figuring out, something different to do for every author. So, I'm editing a debut writer and somebody who's been writing for 6 decades, and the things that those two writers need in terms of line edits and structural edits are going to be really different. So that flexibility and sort of, that just like that toolkit, when I come back to my own writing, and one, it's like encountering an old friend that you don't remember that well. So there's like a certain freshness to it and never feels stale. And two, because I've just figured out how to, edit such different kinds of writers and solve for so many different problems. Nothing feels, plenty of things feel daunting, but nothing feels impossible the same way. Like, I'm able to think about ways to fix it. So in that way, I'm really grateful for the editing practice. It just, when I was working on this book, we were giving Deborah Eisenberg a Lifetime Achievement Award. And so I was reading Deborah Eisenberg stories all summer long. And I thought, oh my God, I don't know how to write dialogue. Deborah Eisenberg knows how to write dialogue. And I still have a ton of work to do on my dialogue, but I was able to see, this is how it's done. This is exciting. What I've done is not exciting. Let's get it closer. And just approach it with a certain amount of drive and objectivity. So yeah, I'd love to, have, I've talked about this before, and I think what would be best is like 3 more Thursdays. I don't want to write all weekend. Fridays are good for conversations like this and a little bit of work, but just it's hard to find time for all of it. But I do welcome the toggle. I
just had a very good question. speaking of editing, you know, writers, big name writers and debut writers, do you ever run into intractable kind of writers who want nothing to do with the edits that you suggest, or do you have like enough clout at the Paris Review that everyone listens?
No, I still encounter it occasionally. I say occasionally. I feel like, you know, from when I was 30 and had, you know, 2-story publications to my name and was taking over the Southern Review all the way up through now, like, you never know when a writer will not take, a writer you've never worked with before will be more stubborn or less stubborn. And so I'm just always sort of prepared for that. You know, I don't really light foot around it in terms of, I'll still give them the notes. If they really won't take them, it's their work, and I want it to look the way they want it to look, but, you know, I will push back. I'm not like Gordon Lish about it. I don't cut a ton, but I'm pretty, you know, with a story and with a quarterly, you have the bandwidth to be really precise about language and really precise about line editing. So I am a hard ass that way, you know, and like, I'm not going to fall on my sword over a semicolon, but, you know, if they don't take it the first time, we'll try to talk about it another way.
So. Right. I think that I always admire a leader who can be diplomatic in that way. I was just talking to my husband about this in his job and dealing with personalities that you want to just like stomp out of the room sometimes.
Sometimes, yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's always horror stories. I remember one person like just hated their check changes, so I had to call him on a Saturday and talk through every edit and like explain, you know, there was like a concise sentence explaining why I made these changes, but, you know, he wanted to have a long conversation about every sentence. So that was hard. And then, you know, another one, it was, I think, a 10,000 word story, and I did the edit, and I was so proud of it and thought it was making it so much better. And he steadied almost everything. And then he got to the end and he changed the ending. And he said, you know, I've been doing this for 50 years and this is the first time I've changed an ending, but you were right about it. And I could tell that because of all the thought you put in along the way with all these other queries. So, yeah, I think it's a personality thing. I'm not a shouter.
Let's see, have you talked about her illustrations yet? No, we have not. So I would love to talk about your illustrations
Sure.
And what you're up to with those, and please talk about your project with the Women of Congress as well.
Yeah, so, you know, I had this painting degree and I was making these really big, messy oil paints. And actually, you know, the stuff I was doing, I was painting on board and drilling into it with a Dremel and then building up all this wax material. So it was really 3D and really dirty. I mean, sawdust and off-gassing oils plus wax just takes like a month to dry. And I love the paintings, but I was just like, this isn't sustainable in New York. I can't paint this way. It's not healthy. It's not, I don't have a space to do it well or safely. I am going to learn how to paint with watercolors. And so I switched from these big, messy, wet, goopy oil paints into, you know, a very precise watercolor. At the same time, you know, I'd had the opportunity to do some cartooning. I made a graphic novel for like an independent study and after school about, you know, I was in Madrid during the train bombings. Ben Lerner and Atocha Station sort of did it more eloquently, but that same experience of being an expatriate in Madrid during this terrorist attack, I made a cartoon about that, and then I had the opportunity to do some other graphic novels. and I did not like the little boxes. Like it didn't feel right. And so I spent all this time thinking about what I liked about comics and what I didn't like about comics. And I really like sort of the sequentialness of it, the the idea of the iterative storytelling and the scale. But I didn't like, having to make all the backgrounds or the expectation of realism in a lot of graphic novels. And so I said, okay, can I sort of do the stuff I like about comics, but get rid of the box, while I'm also thinking about shrinking down this like really painterly practice to watercolors. And those two things met, and they met with the Women of Congress. This was in an earlier era where gender just representation was sort of, it was during, so I was concerned about gender and equal representation in national government. Obviously there's like more acute things right now, but it felt like a big deal. And of course it was, at a moment where there were more women in Congress than ever before, but it was still such a stark minority of Congress was, seats held by women. And so I started thinking about, the small scale of comics plus watercolors, these bright, beautiful colors that they're all wearing, sort of like peacocks. The power suit has been toned down, but, when I started this project, there was still a lot of hot pink power suits out there. And thinking about, why are elected leaders, is it a fashion statement? Is it societal expectation to dress in a certain feminine way, even if you're in a position of power? What are all the structures that make women wear these get-ups while guys just get to wear a pinstripe suit? And so, but also painting all those beautiful colors and, was fun, and thinking about how they look together as a group, the most powerful woman in the country, but also, wearing teal and yellow and lots of pink. So I painted all the women in Congress, and, this was sort of right at the beginning, I think, not the beginning of the internet, but I was able to do this very handmade thing, but then scan and digitize them and manipulate the information. So made infographics about that disparity of representation. And people listened. It was just really exciting to see, how visual arts and these small watercolors, which was this really personal act, presented the information in a way that people understood. There's, 4 guys for every woman in Congress, and why is that, and how can we do better? It was a bit sprawling, but that was the project.
With the infographics, sounds a lot like kind of, similar to, I think, what we do in children's book publishing is thinking about what's the information we need to convey visually, and what's the information that words need to convey, and how can those two kind of work together to tell the story. And they can't be the exact same thing, they have to complement each other.
Right, exactly. And that's, what graphic novels try to unpack as well.
Yeah.
And it's so compelling, and it's such an interesting riddle. And, to have cut out a fifth of my book, I believe in economy, and I think, when you're putting words and images together, that, it's just compounded, that you've got to be very thoughtful about how you're presenting information. So it was a fun thing to explore, and it was just really powerful that it resonated. I think, going all the way back to Goya and his political prints, there's this really long tradition that I've admired for a long time about political art. And, I've started sketching vice presidential candidates, but no new watercolors yet.
I was going to ask what your next illustration project is. Okay, so we'll look forward to possible vice president presidential candidates.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we are almost out of time. If anybody else has a question, ask now or forever hold your peace. I have one more, I'm curious about one more thing regarding the Paris Review. And I feel like if you're the editor of the Paris Review, you must be asked this question. What is your favorite interview of a writer that's been published in the pages?
That's a great question. I mean, there's been over 400, so it's a little hard to pick the favorites. You know, of the ones I've worked on, I've done 16 now. And, you know, you have to read their whole body of work and understand the history of their interview record and try to make it new, but also retrospective. And it feels like studying for comps, you know,
Yeah.
8 times a year. I love George Saunders' interview. He was very, very generous, and it's hopeful and heartfelt and candid in a way that was really great. So maybe that one. Do you have a favorite?
I am a huge Elizabeth Bishop fan, so it may be like the early 1980s interview with Bishop.
Yeah, it was 82 or 83.
Yeah.
And that one's great. The Ishmael Reed interview from 2016, I was just rereading, and that one's great. Of course, a lot of people have been looking to James Baldwin recently, and I feel really fortunate that we had him in the series, and that was a great interview.
Cool. I would suggest everyone go check out the interviews at the very least. They're super interesting and in-depth, and like you said, you have the interviewers do their homework in a big way. Well, you have been super generous as well, and we want to thank you for your time and for reading from your book. And if you have not read the Cactus League, go out and get it. It's really interesting and thought-provoking, and also just beautifully written novel by Emily. And I just quickly want to say that from everyone at Greensboro Bound, we thank you for joining us. And there are 2 events in July, July 9th and July 11th, also at 7 p.m. You can check it out on the website, greensborobound.com/events. One is a reading and Q&A with Laura Beth Johnson, a YA author of The Goddess and the Machine. And I think that might actually be a Scuppernong Books reading. And then on the 11th is an author panel with debut authors Elizabeth Childs Shelburne and Molly Dektar and Carter Sickles. And you can get your copies of those books from Scuppernong Books. So we have also a comment from Brian. Thank you for a fascinating conversation. So this has been great fun, and it's been lovely talking to you. And
my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thanks so much. And everybody, thanks for joining. We will talk to you soon.
Great.
Thanks,
Have
Emily.
a good weekend. Bye.
Bye.